I never expected to wake up to the sound of slamming car doors and engines idling on my family farm at 7 a.m. on a Saturday. The noise jolted me awake, yanking me from a dream about this season's tomato harvest. My blood was already boiling before my feet even hit the floor. Grabbing my robe and shoving my feet into work boots, I rushed outside without bothering to change out of my pajamas. What I saw made me freeze in disbelief. At least a dozen cars were neatly parked in rows across my east field, the same field where I'd planned to plant corn next. What the hell? I muttered, my dog, Rusty, barking furiously beside me. A woman in a pristine blue blazer with perfectly styled blonde hair was directing traffic, waving more vehicles onto MY property like she owned the place. She clutched a clipboard and wore that fake smile people put on when they think they're in charge. Hey, what do you think you're doing? I shouted, jogging across my yard. The woman turned, looking irritated at the interruption. Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she extended her manicured hand. Good morning. I'm Margaret Wilson, president of the Evergreen Meadows Homeowners Association. I ignored her hand. I don't care if you're the president of the United States. This is private property, my property, and you're trespassing. Margaret tilted her head slightly, like I was a child who didn't understand basic concepts. Oh, you must be confused. This area was designated as community overflow parking in our HOA bylaws. She glanced at her clipboard. Are you the Davis who lives in the old farmhouse? We've been trying to contact you about joining our association. My grandfather's words echoed in my head. Never let them take an inch, Alex, or they'll steal the whole farm. Not confused at all, I replied, pulling out my phone to show her my property deed. I've never signed any HOA agreement. This land has been in my family for generations. We're not part of your development. Margaret's perfect smile faltered. Well, this has been designated community parking for years. The previous board must have had an arrangement with your grandfather. My grandfather would never allow this, I said firmly. He taught me to value every inch of this soil. By now, other neighbors had gathered, watching our argument. Some looked embarrassed, others annoyed at the delay. A man in golf clothes called out, "Hurry up, we'll be late for the tournament." That's when I noticed something that made me forget about the parking situation entirely. A large pickup truck was backing up toward my backfield, straight toward the tomato plants I'd spent weeks nurturing. "Stop that truck right now," I shouted, breaking into a run. "You're destroying my crops." The driver, seeing me running and waving, hit the brakes just inches from my carefully tended rows. He rolled down his window. Lady at the entrance told me to park big vehicles back here. I whirled around to find Margaret right behind me, her face flushed with anger. "Mr. Davis, you're making a scene," she hissed. "We have a community golf tournament today, and this is the designated overflow area." "Says who?" I demanded. "Show me one document with my signature on it. Our community bylaws clearly state." "I'm not part of your community," I interrupted, "and you have exactly 1 hour to get these vehicles off my property before I call the sheriff and have them all towed at the owner's expense." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't dare." I pulled out my phone. "Try me." She grabbed my wrist. "Listen to me carefully. Evergreen Meadows is home to the mayor, 2 city council members, and Judge Reynolds. Who do you think the sheriff will side with? A bunch of respected community leaders or one stubborn farmer?" I jerked my arm away. "Take your hands off me. That's assault now, on top of trespassing." A few neighbors had wandered close enough to hear our argument. An older gentleman stepped forward. "Margaret, maybe we should just move the cars if this is really his property." "It's HOA property now," Margaret snapped. "And you can all thank Mr. Davis here when you're late for tea time." As if on cue, a black SUV pulled up and a sleek-looking man in an expensive suit stepped out. He walked straight to Margaret, completely ignoring me. "Is there a problem?" he asked. Margaret smiled, suddenly looking relieved. "Perfect timing, Jeffrey. Our friend here seems confused about the parking arrangement." Jeffrey turned to me, extending his hand. "Jeffrey Williams, HOA attorney." "And you are?" "The legal owner of the property you're all trespassing on," I replied, not taking his hand. His smile didn't falter. "I understand your confusion. The easement agreement that allows for community parking on this portion of land was established years ago. I have copies back in my office. An easement I never signed," I insisted. "Show me the paperwork right now." "We can discuss this civilly," Jeffrey said smoothly. "Perhaps over coffee?" There's no need for threats. I looked around at my invaded farm, cars on my growing fields, entitled people staring at me like I was the problem. Something in me snapped. "You have 1 hour," I repeated. "Then I'm calling the sheriff, the local news, and every towing company in the county." I turned and walked back to my house, ignoring Margaret's threats behind me. Inside, my hand was shaking so badly I could barely dial the phone. "County Records Office," A friendly voice answered. "This is Alex Davis at the old Miller farm outside Evergreen Meadows. I need to check if there are any easements or agreements attached to my property. It's urgent. We close at noon today." The voice replied. "Can you come right now?" I glanced at my watch. 9:15 a.m. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. As I grabbed my keys, I looked out the window. Instead of moving cars, more were arriving. Margaret was directing a pickup truck to park right against my tomato plants. I saw her look toward my house with a smirk on her face. This wasn't just about parking anymore. This was war. The county records office was quiet on Saturday morning, with only 2 employees working the weekend shift. The older gentleman at the desk looked up as I burst through the doors. "I'm Alex Davis. I called about property records for the Miller farm." He nodded, holding out his hand. "Frank Jenkins. Been working here 30 years. I knew your grandfather. This caught me by surprise." "You did." "Old man Miller was quite a character," Frank said with a smile. "Smart as a whip, especially when it came to protecting what was his." Frank led me to a small research room filled with filing cabinets and computers. "Your property has an interesting history. The developers who built Evergreen Meadows tried to buy your grandfather's land for years. He always refused to sell," I said proudly. "That he did," Frank agreed. "Drove him crazy. They even tried to have the land condemned at one point, claiming it was a public nuisance." My stomach tightened. "That sounds familiar." Frank pulled several thick folders from a cabinet. "Let's see what we got here. Property deeds, tax records, building permits." He spread the documents on the table, putting on reading glasses. After 20 minutes of searching, Frank sat back. "Just as I thought. There's no easement for parking or public access on your property. Not a single document showing your grandfather ever agreed to let the HOA use his land." Relief washed over me. "So they're definitely trespassing?" "Without a doubt," Frank confirmed. "But there is something interesting here." He pulled out a yellow document. "Your grandfather granted the power company an easement 30 years ago to run electrical infrastructure through the north corner of your property." I leaned forward. "What does that mean exactly?" Frank showed me a faded map. "According to this, the main transformer supplying power to Evergreen Meadows is located on your land. Your grandfather negotiated this when the development was first built. The power company pays you $500 annually for access." I stared at him. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" Frank's eyes twinkled. "The HOA community's electricity runs through your property. Legally, you control access to that transformer. Can they move it?" I asked. "Not easily," Frank replied. "It would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars and require county approval, new permits, and probably a long service interruption, plus your permission to terminate the current easement." My mind was racing. "What about those payments?" "I've never received any money from the power company." Frank typed something into his computer. "Payments have been going to a trust account in your grandfather's name. Since his passing, they've been accumulated. You should contact Pinewood Electric about updating the payment information." I left the records office with copies of everything, my heart pounding with a mix of anger and excitement. On the drive home, I called Pinewood Electric's emergency line. "This is Alex Davis. I own the property where transformer station E245 is located. I need to speak with someone immediately about unauthorized access to this equipment." After being transferred twice, I finally reached the operations manager. "Mr. Davis, I'm Ron Fletcher. What seems to be the problem?" "Someone from Evergreen Meadows HOA is claiming rights to my property." I explained. "I'm concerned about unauthorized access to the transformer station." "That's a serious safety issue," Ron said. "That station serves over 200 homes in that development. Only authorized personnel should be anywhere near it." "Exactly my concern," I replied. "I'll be installing security cameras today and would like to confirm who has legitimate access." "Only Pinewood Electric technicians with proper ID," Ron assured me. "I can email you the maintenance schedule so you're aware when our people will be on site." By the time I pulled into my driveway, I had a plan. To my surprise, most of the cars were gone from my field. Only 3 remained, along with deep tire tracks and crushed plants. I surveyed the damage to my tomato field, taking photos with my phone. Several plants were completely flattened, representing weeks of work and future income destroyed. Inside my house, I printed the documents from the county office and organized them in a folder. Then I found the old property surveys my grandfather had kept, showing exact boundaries and landmarks. Just as I finished, a knock came at my door. Margaret stood there with Jeffrey Williams, the HOA attorney. 2 other people stood behind them, a middle-aged man with a stern expression and a young woman holding a clip. "Mr. Davis," Margaret began, her tone falsely pleasant, "we've brought the parking agreement for you to sign." "Just a formality, really." I stared at her for a long moment. "No cars on my property by the end of the day, and I expect payment for the damage to my crops." The battle for my family farm was about to reach a whole new level. Jeffrey stepped forward. "That's not how this works. The HOA board has already voted to designate this area for community use. We're simply asking for your cooperation. And if I don't cooperate, I challenged. The stern-looking man spoke up. I'm Robert Thompson, City Councilman. This community represents significant tax revenue for our city. Surely we can reach a reasonable arrangement that benefits everyone. The young woman with the clipboard looked uncomfortable. The environmental impact study for additional parking within Evergreen Meadows would take months. This is really the only viable option for community events. These people were unbelievable. They'd invaded my property, damaged my crops, and now were acting like I was the problem. I could feel my pulse pounding in my temples, but suddenly I felt strangely calm. I had an ace up my sleeve they knew nothing about. I smiled, which seemed to unnerve them. I've just come from the county records office, I said, holding on my folder. There is no easement for parking on my property. Never has been. Margaret waved her hand dismissively. Old paperwork can be updated. I've also discovered something interesting about your community's power supply. I continued, showing them the easement documents. The transformer serving your entire neighborhood? It's on my land. Their faces changed instantly. Margaret's smile disappeared. Jeffrey straightened his tie. The councilman took a small step backward. I'm officially revoking access for non-essential maintenance until we resolve this situation, I announced. I've already spoken with Pinewood Electric about unauthorized personnel near their equipment. You can't do that. Margaret sputtered, her face turning red. People have medical equipment, refrigerators. I'm not cutting your power, I clarified. I'm just exercising my property rights, the same way you're trying to exercise yours over my farm. The councilman cleared his throat. Let's not be hasty. I'm sure we can work something out. I agree, I said calmly. Here's my proposal. All vehicles off my property by 5 p.m., full compensation for crop damage, and a signed acknowledgement that my land is not HOA property. Or what? Margaret challenged, though her voice had lost its edge. I held up the power easement document. I exercise my right to deny access for scheduled maintenance next week. Hot summer coming up. Would be a shame if the system couldn't handle the load because it couldn't be properly serviced. Jeffrey whispered something to Margaret, his expression now serious. She glared at me, then at him, before turning to the others. This is ridiculous. He's bluffing. Am I? I pulled out my phone. Should I call Ron Fletcher at Pinewood Electric again? He seemed very concerned about unauthorized activity near their transformer. The young woman with the clipboard spoke up. Margaret, maybe we should consider his offer. The association can't afford a power outage during the summer gala next weekend. Margaret's face twitched with suppressed rage. Fine, we'll move the vehicles. But this isn't over, Mr. Davis. One more thing, I said, pointing to my damaged field. I estimate about $2,000 in crop damage. I'll expect a check by Monday. $2,000? Margaret scoffed. For some squash plants? Absolutely not. The councilman stepped forward. The city might be able to offer a one-time community relations grant to cover agricultural restoration as a gesture of goodwill. What he really meant was hush money, but I wasn't about to turn it down. That would be acceptable. And the acknowledgement, Jeffrey asked, his lawyer brain already working on the details. Simple documents stating that my property is not subject to HOA regulations and that the board acknowledges my full property rights according to the county survey markers. I'll draft something, Jeffrey said begrudgingly. They left in a hurry, huddled together in urgent conversation as they walked to their cars. I watched from my window as they drove away, feeling both victorious and uneasy. This wasn't over. People like Margaret didn't give up easily. My phone rang. It was Ron from Pinewood Electric. Mr. Davis, I've been told there might be an access issue with transformer E245. Is everything okay? I took a deep breath. There's been a misunderstanding with the local HOA. They seem to think they have rights to my property. That's concerning, Ron replied. That transformer is critical infrastructure. Any access issues could affect service reliability for hundreds of homes. I understand, I said. I don't want anyone to lose power. I just need the HOA to respect my property rights. Tell you what, Ron offered. I can come out Monday morning to inspect the transformer and discuss optimal access arrangements. Sometimes a little official presence helps clear things up. I thanked him and hung up, feeling slightly more optimistic. Through my window, I could see several cars with HOA stickers driving slowly past my farm. By evening, the remaining vehicles had been removed from my field. A small victory, but I knew the war was far from over. Margaret would be plotting her next move, and I needed to be ready. At least now, I had something she needed more than I needed her approval. Power, in more ways than one. That night, I slept like a rock, thinking the worst was behind me. Boy, was I wrong. The next morning, I heard the mail truck and wandered out to my mailbox, still in my pajamas. Among the usual junk was a thick envelope with the Evergreen Meadows HOA logo stamped on it. My stomach dropped. Inside was a formal notice informing me that I was being fined $5,000 for unauthorized landscape modifications and agricultural activities contrary to community aesthetic standards. The letter stated that I had 72 hours to remove all farming equipment visible from community roadways and cease all commercial agricultural activities or face additional fines of $500 per day. At the bottom was Margaret's signature with a handwritten note. Perhaps now you'll reconsider our generous parking agreement. You've got to be kidding me, I muttered, my hands shaking with anger. Then I noticed something strange. The letterhead listed my property address as being part of Evergreen Meadows. They were pretending I was already under their jurisdiction. I called Frank at the county records office. They can't fine you if you're not a member, he confirmed after hearing my story. But be careful. I've seen HOAs like this before. They'll try to wear you down. What should I do? Document everything, get security cameras, and maybe talk to Oliver Jenkins. He's an attorney who specializes in fighting overreaching HOAs. Handled a similar case last year in Pine Creek. I thanked him and immediately ordered security cameras online. While checking out, I noticed an email notification. The power company had just deposited this year's easement payment into my account. An idea began forming in my mind. I looked up Oliver Jenkins' number and left a message explaining my situation. Then I decided to inspect the transformer on my property. The small green box I'd barely noticed before now seemed so important. As I approached, I spotted fresh footprints in the mud surrounding. Someone had been here recently. The access panel looked slightly ajar. I was about to take a closer look when I heard a car screech to a halt on the road behind me. "That's him," Margaret shouted, pointing at me, standing near the transformer. He was just tampering with it. A Pinewood electric truck was parked beside her SUV, and a worker in company overalls was hurrying toward me. My heart pounded in my chest. She was trying to frame me. "I just got here," I said calmly to the worker. The panel was already open. "Look at the security cameras in my barn if you don't believe me." I was bluffing. My cameras wouldn't arrive until tomorrow. The worker, his name tag read Dave, looked confused. "Ma'am, we don't have any reports of tamper." "Check it," Margaret demanded. "He threatened to cut our power yesterday." Dave approached the transformer cautiously and examined the panel. "This has definitely been tampered with. The access lock is broken." He turned to me with suspicion. "Sir, did you do this?" "Absolutely not," I replied. "I just noticed it myself and was about to call it in. My security cameras will show I've been in my house all morning until 5 minutes ago." "Convenient that you mentioned cameras," Margaret sneered. "Where are they? I don't see any." "Dave, when was the last time an official power company employee checked this transformer?" "According to our records, not for at least 3 months," Dave said, checking his tablet. I turned to Margaret. "How did you know the panel was open?" "You drove straight here and pointed out." Her face flushed. I noticed it earlier when you were trespassing on my property. I finished for her. Or when someone you sent was breaking the lock." Dave looked between us, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm going to need to file a report about this." "Please do," I said. "And I'd like a copy, along with confirmation that no one from Evergreen Meadows has authorization to access this equipment." Margaret stormed back to her SUV without another word. Dave spent 30 minutes securing the transformer and taking photos. He gave me his card and promised to have his supervisor call me. That night, Oliver Jenkins returned my call. After hearing my story, he agreed to represent me. "Classic HOA overreach," he said. "They target properties they want to control, especially ones that don't fit their aesthetic vision. The good news is you've got leverage with the transformer easement." A week passed without incident. I filed formal complaints about the trespassing and tampering, installed security cameras, and began working with Oliver to draft a cease and desist letter to the HOA. Then, early Monday morning, my new alarm system woke me at 4:30 a.m. The security app on my phone showed movement at my east fence. I rubbed my eyes in disbelief at what I was seeing. Someone was cutting through my newly repaired fence with bolt cutters. I called the sheriff immediately and rushed outside with my phone, recording video. By the time I reached the fence, 3 sections had been cut open, and a line of cars was already pulling into my field. "This is private property," I shouted, continuing to record. "You're trespassing." A woman in the first car rolled down her window. "We have permission from the HOA. Check your email if you don't believe me." One by one, each driver showed me the same email from Margaret authorizing them to park in the community overflow lot on my property. The email claimed the dispute had been officially resolved. The battle had just escalated to a whole new level of dirt. When Sheriff Reynolds arrived 20 minutes later, 12 cars were already parked on my lane. He looked uncomfortable as I showed him the cut fence and my videos. "I'm sorry, but there's not much I can do right now," he explained after speaking with several drivers. "The HOA has submitted documents to the county showing this area is designated community park." "What documents?" "Those are forgeries," I protested, showing him my property deed on my phone. "Look," He sighed. This is becoming a civil matter. You've got conflicting claims and paperwork. Take it up in court. I can't just tow all these people's cars based on your word against the HOAs. After he left, I called Oliver, who promised to file for an emergency injunction that day. But courts moved slowly, and meanwhile, more cars kept coming. Fuming, I walked to Elena's house. She had always been straight with me. She invited me in for coffee, her face showing concern. I need to show you something, she said once we were seated at her kitchen table. She pulled out her tablet. I'm on the HOA email list. What they're doing isn't right. She opened her email and showed me a series of messages between Margaret, Jeffrey, and other board members. They discussed strategies for annexing the eyesore and forcing compliance through escalating pressure. Keep scrolling, Elena said grimly. The next email contained something that made my stomach drop, a scanned document with what appeared to be my grandfather's signature on an HOA agreement from 15 years ago. That's fake, I whispered. My grandfather would never have signed this. I know, Elena replied. Look at the date, April 2009. Your grandfather was still the owner then. Yes, until he passed away 3 years ago, but that's not his signature. I've seen enough of his documents to know. Elena nodded. I thought so. Margaret's husband works at a printing company. He has access to equipment that could easily produce this. She scrolled to another email, this one from yesterday. It gets worse. They're holding an emergency board meeting tonight at 7. Special guest, Margaret's cousin who works for the power company. They're discussing options to permanently resolve the transformer issue. What does that mean? I asked, though I feared I already knew. They're planning to reroute the electricity to bypass your property entirely. Her cousin says it's expensive, but doable. Once that happens, you lose your leverage. I sat back, stunned by how far they were willing to go. Why are you showing me this? Won't you get in trouble? Elena sighed. I bought my house here because it backed up to your farm. I loved seeing the open fields, the crops, not another cookie cutter house. They've been trying to force out anything that doesn't fit their perfect community vision for years. My phone buzzed with a text from Oliver. Judge Henderson granted our emergency hearing tomorrow, 9 a.m. Bring all documentation. I showed Elena the message. Will you testify about these emails if needed? She hesitated only briefly before nodding. Yes, this has gone too far. As I walked home, I noticed a power company truck parked near my property line. Margaret's cousin was already getting to work. I had less than 24 hours to stop them. Back at my house, I gathered every document I had, property deeds, easement agreements, photos of the damage, security videos, everything. Then I made one more call to the local news station. I have a story about HOA corruption, forged documents, and property rights, I told the reporter. And it all comes to a head at a public meeting tonight. My heart pounded as I stood outside the Pack Community Center that evening. Through the window, I could see Margaret waving her hands excitedly, pointing at huge photos of my farm now marked with parking spaces and walkways. People nodded along, completely fooled by her lies. I clutched my folder of evidence, took a deep breath, and pushed open the door. The room went quiet as I walked in. Margaret froze mid-sentence, her mouth hanging open like a fish. Well, look who decided to join us, she said, regaining her composure. We were just discussing the community improvements plan for that thing you call a farm. Several people laughed. I felt my face burn, but kept walking straight to the front of the room. Actually, I'm glad you're all here, I said loudly. There's something you all deserve to know about what your HOA leadership has been doing with your money and your trust. Margaret rushed toward me. He's trespassing. Someone call security. An older man in the front row stood up. Let him speak, Margaret. I want to hear what he has to say. Others nodded in agreement. I could see Margaret's perfect smile cracking at the edges. Fine, you have 2 minutes, she snapped. I connected my laptop to their projector while saying, I think you'll want to give me more than 2 minutes once you see this. The first slide appeared, a copy of my property deed and survey map showing clear boundaries. Whispers spread through the crowd. As you can see, my farm has never been part of Evergreen Meadows. I've never signed any HOA agreement. I clicked to the next slide, the forged document with my grandfather's signature that Elena had discovered. This is a forgery your board created. My grandfather passed away 3 years ago, but this document is dated just 6 months ago. The room erupted. Margaret lunged for my laptop, but I moved it away just in time. He's making this up, she shouted, her face turning bright red. This troublemaker has been breaking our rules since he moved in. I calmly clicked to the next slide. The emails between Margaret and Jeffrey discussing how to force compliance through escalating pressure and make his life miserable until he gives in. These are your HOA emails discussing the plan to harass me off my property, I explained. And this one shows Margaret authorizing $30,000 of your dues for legal consultations about taking my land. An angry buzz filled the room. People were standing now, pointing at Margaret and the board members seated at the front table. "Where did you get those?" Jeffrey demanded, his lawyer face suddenly looking worried. "That's not important," I replied. "What's important is that your leadership has been lying to you." A woman stood up near the back. "My husband and I paid a $500 fine last month for having a vegetable garden that was too visible from a street. Meanwhile, you're spending our money on this." Others joined in with similar stories. The room grew louder with each passing second. Margaret grabbed the microphone. "Everyone calm down. This is a complicated legal matter that you don't understand. We're acting in the community's best interest." I clicked to my final slide, the county records showing the electrical easement. "One last thing you should know," I said, raising my voice above the noise. "The main transformer that powers your entire community sits on my property. Your homes get electricity because my grandfather allowed the power company to place equipment on our land." The room went completely silent. "Is that true?" someone finally asked. "Absolutely," I replied. "I've confirmed it with the county records office and the power company. I have no desire to interfere with your electricity. I just want to be left alone to run my farm in peace." Thomas, a gray-haired man I recognized as living on the edge of the development, stood up. "I've had enough of this." "Margaret, is any of this true? Have you been lying to us?" Margaret's face twisted with rage. "This meeting is over. Everyone needs to leave immediately." "Not until we get answers," shouted Elena from the back of the room. Jeffrey leaned over and whispered something in Margaret's ear. She pushed him away. "I don't care about legal consequences," she shrieked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've worked too hard to let some dirt farmer ruin everything." The crowd gasped. Margaret realized her mistake too late. "What I meant was," she started, but people were already shouting questions. "Have you been targeting other homeowners too? What else have you been spending our money on? Did you really forge documents?" Margaret grabbed her purse and headed for the side door. "This meeting is adjourned. The board will issue a statement tomorrow." Thomas blocked her path. "No, Margaret, I think we need a vote right now. All in favor of suspending the current board pending an investigation, raise your hands." Almost every hand in the room shot up. "You can't do this. It's against the bylaws." Margaret's face went from red to purple. "Actually," I said quietly, "your bylaws allow for emergency removal of board members in cases of suspected financial impropriety. Section 8. Paragraph 4. Margaret stared at me with pure hatred. Then she reached in her purse and pulled out her phone. She dialed a number and spoke into it while staring directly at me. "Do it now," she said clearly. "All of it." 3 seconds later, the lights went out. Emergency lights flickered on, casting eerie shadows across the shocked faces. Margaret's laugh cut through the darkness. "See what happens when you challenge me? Your precious farm controls our electricity? Let's see how you like it." Her voice was cut off by the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. Screams filled the dark room as people fumbled with their phones for light. My phone lit up. The power company called. "Hello," I answered loudly. Everyone went quiet. I put on speaker. "Mr. Davis, we caught someone messing with your transformer. A woman in a blazer. Our cameras got everything. Police are on their way." Margaret's face turned white as a ghost. "He's lying," she shrieked, but residents were already surrounding her, phones recording. "You try to cut the power yourself to blame me?" I asked, shocked at how far she'd gone. The doors burst open as police officers entered with flashlights. Jeffrey tried sneaking out the back, but ran straight into Officer Reynolds. The local news vans pulled up outside. Elena had called them earlier, just in case. "Margaret Wilson," one officer called out, "we need you to come with us. We have video evidence of you tampering with electrical infrastructure, which is a federal offense." "This is ridiculous." Margaret sputtered. "I was inspecting it. Ask my cousin at the power company." "Ma'am, your cousin has already been suspended pending investigation," the officer replied calmly. "He admitted to giving you access codes after we showed him the video." Another officer approached Jeffrey. "And you must be Jeffrey Williams? We have a warrant to search your office regarding allegations of document forgery." The room erupted in chaos as officers escorted Margaret and Jeffrey outside. Camera flashes lit up the night from the news crews capturing every moment. Thomas, the gray-haired man who had stood up to Margaret, turned to the stunned crowd. "I move that we establish an interim board tonight and schedule proper elections within 30 days. All in favor." A forest of hands shot up. 2 weeks later, I was planting new tomato seedlings in the field that had been trampled when Elena pulled up in her car. "You're a local celebrity now," she laughed, handing me a newspaper. The headline read, "HOA Warriors Victory Garden, How One Farmer Stood Up to Corruption." The article detailed how Margaret and Jeffrey were facing multiple charges, including forgery, trespassing, property damage, and utility tampering. The investigation had uncovered years of abuses, fines collected for non-existent violations, contracts awarded to friends and family, and systematic harassment of homeowners who questioned authority. How's the new board working out? I asked, wiping soil from my hands. Amazing, Elena beamed. Thomas was elected president unanimously. First thing he did was slash dues by 30% and create a transparency committee. Every expenditure over $500 requires membership approval now. I nodded, pleased but still cautious. And what about this place? I gestured to my farm. Any more plans to turn it into a parking lot? Actually, that's why I'm here, Elena said. Thomas is on his way. He wants to talk to you. Thomas's car pulled up a few minutes later. He walked over with a friendly wave, looking relaxed in jeans and a casual shirt. A far cry from Margaret's always perfect business attire. Beautiful crops you've got starting, he said, genuinely admiring my work. I wanted to come in person to officially apologize for everything the previous board put you through. I appreciate that, I said, surprised by the gesture. We also took a vote, Thomas continued. The community unanimously agreed to compensate you for all damages to your property and crops. And we'd like to propose something else. He handed me a folder. Inside was a proposal for a farmer's market in the empty lot behind the community center, with my farm as the anchor event. There was also a draft agreement for educational tours where I could teach interested residents about sustainable farming. Instead of fighting about where our properties meet, we thought we might benefit from working together, Thomas explained. No obligation, of course, just an idea. I looked at the proposal, then at my farm, the land my grandfather had fought so hard to preserve. You know, my grandfather wasn't against development or community. He just believed in respecting boundaries and doing things the right way. Thomas nodded. That's all we want too. Good neighbors, clear boundaries, and mutual respect. A month later, the first Evergreen Meadows Farmers Market opened with a line of customers stretching around the block. My stand, featuring HOA Fighters Victory tomatoes, sold out within 2 hours. The power company installed a new, more secure transformer housing on my property, along with a proper access road, and increased the annual easement payment to better reflect current land values. Most surprisingly, many HOA residents became regular visitors to my farm. Children came for educational tours about where food comes from. Retirees volunteered to help with the harvest, enjoying the physical work and fresh air. One evening, as the sun set over my cornfield, I sat on my porch with Elena and Thomas, sharing a pitcher of homemade lemonade. You know what's funny? Elena said, Margaret was so determined to make your farm part of our community that she never realized it already was. Just not on her terms. Thomas laughed. The irony is that by trying to control everything, she ended up losing it all. The judge denied her bail yesterday. Apparently, utility tampering is taken very seriously. I looked out over my fields, golden in the sunset light, and then at the neat houses of Evergreen Meadows beyond. The fence between us was still there. Boundaries matter, but there was a proper gate now, with a sign reading Farm Tours Thursday through Sunday. My grandfather used to say that good fences make good neighbors. I reflect, but I think he'd agree that good neighbors make the fences less necessary. Thomas raised his glass to boundaries respected and bridges built. We clinked glasses as the fireflies began to twinkle across my fields, the lights of Evergreen Meadows homes glowing warmly in the distance, neither one threatening the other anymore.